Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. This has been a wonderful experience doing these series. Um, all of these webinars are available on our YouTube channel. So if you've missed any, they're available. I'd like to introduce Dr. Katie Young and Catherine Whitehouse, both from KER, both nutritionists with KER. And we're going to go through just some topics that we all hear quite a bit for myths and sort of misinformation topics. So I really hope you enjoy it. So I'm going to hand it over to Katie.
And going to introduce myself again, try to be quick this time. If you haven't been on the other webinars, this is me. I am a horse person. These are some of my horses that I have had and currently have. My background, got my bachelor's degree at Missouri State, went to Texas A&M for grad school in equine nutrition and exercise physiology, and stayed at A&M on the faculty for a few years, and then left Texas A&M to take a job as equine nutritionist at Farmland Industries, which is no more. And after Farmland went bankrupt, I started working as an independent equine nutritionist and did contract work actually with Purina for several years. And then Purina hired me. And this is Purina in the US. And I was technical equine nutritionist in charge of horse feed formulas and supporting marketing and sales and all sorts of that kind of thing. And then parted ways with Purina. And I've known Dr. Joe Pagan, who is the founder and owner of Kentucky Equine Research, for several years. And Joe and I talked and realized that it would be a really nice fit for me to do work as a consulting equine nutritionist for KER. And I'm also an independent nutritionist still, and I offer consulting for veterinarians and horse owners. And I give some writing lessons for fun on the side. So that is me. And Catherine did not put together a slide for herself. So I'm going to introduce almost Dr. Catherine Whitehouse, who's finishing up her research work on her PhD, and with much pressure, hopefully soon will be doing her prelims and orals and get that out of the way, and be a PhD equine nutritionist in the not too distant future. And Catherine has a great deal of experience, much more experience in the field of equine nutrition than a typical new PhD in the field, as she started with Kentucky Equine Research a few years ago, several years ago, as an intern, and then was hired by KER and worked as a nutrition advisor, helping customers with all sorts of nutritional issues with their horses, and then has moved on still with Kentucky Equine Research and has got a great deal of experience now in formulating horse feeds and rations for horses, and just has been presenting research at Equine Science Society meetings, and she can be a great addition to the field of equine nutrition. And so it's great to have Catherine. She's going to kind of chime in some. I put together all the slides to answer some of the questions we've been hearing. And since Catherine has this wealth of knowledge, first, just finishing the coursework fairly recently for the PhD, she's very up to date on the latest research, and so many years of working with horse owners and helping solve problems. She's got some great insights. So this evening we are going to talk about some of the commonly held beliefs in equine nutrition that some of them, even as an equine nutritionist years ago, it was just, these were things that we thought were true. And this is the thing with science, is science is not static. So some of these issues, as we go along in time, we learn more about the topic, and we learn things that we thought were true are not true because we have more information. So again, that's just part of the really importance of science and research and continue learning. The more you learn about horses, the more you learn about equine nutrition, the more you realize you don't know. And there's so much we do not yet know. But some things we've got some good ideas about. We've got some good research behind it. So what I want to talk about this evening, and again, Catherine, at any point, jump on in with your thoughts. But we want to talk about non-structural carbohydrates, NSC, because there's a lot of commonly held ideas of non-structural carbs in horse diets and how they affect horses. And we want to talk a little bit about what about healthy horses? Horses that don't have problems with non-structural carbs. And there are also some pretty strong opinions about non-structural carbs with growing horses. We also want to talk about protein. There are some very strong opinions about protein. So we're just going to touch on how protein functions in the body, why it's important, and its role in growth. We're going to talk some about ingredients. We could spend hours talking about the ideas about different ingredients in horse feeds, but we're going to start. One of the real polarizing ingredients is soy. So we'll talk a little bit about soy. And another kind of polarizing ingredient is molasses. And then we're going to talk about serum allergy testing because there are a lot of horse owners that are concerned about food allergies for horses. And finally, we're going to talk just a little bit about some kind of misconceptions about manufacturing processes. So to start out with non-structural carbs, some of these slides may look familiar if you listened or watched the carb presentation. That was a few months ago now. But first, what are non-structural carbs, or NSC? So basically, NSC are the starch and the sugars in the horse's diets. And so non-structural carbs, they either occur as simple sugars in the horse's feed, or again, starches can be broken down by enzymes produced by the horse. And that includes the sugars glucose, fructose, lactose, sucrose, and then the compound starch, which is basically a bunch of glucose molecules, all hooked together, bound together. NSCs range from being almost non-existent in a grass hay diet to comprising a high percentage of the total diet in a high grain, low fiber ration. Now, I want to point out, even though it says can be almost non-existent in a grass hay diet, that does not mean that all grass hays are low in NSC, because some hay has a fairly substantial amount of NSC, and green grass can certainly have a high level of NSC. But why are carbs important? Well, number one, carbs are fuel. That is a big role of carbohydrates. And there are two types of carbs. We're really going to concentrate on non-structural carbs, the starch and sugars, but also there are structural carbs, which are the fibers that are the primary carbs that you find in forages. But for the non-structural carbs, the primary dietary source would be grains. The non-structural carbs provide glucose, and glucose is so important for horses because it's an immediate source of fuel, and it's the substrate for building glycogen. Glycogen is a form of fuel that is stored in the muscle tissue and in the liver, and it is the main fuel for anaerobic work. So anaerobic work is basically short blasts of power and speed, and for the muscles to perform that type of work, they need the glycogen. They need glucose. Now, NSCs are highly digestible. They can cause digestive disturbances if overfed. If you get too much NSC in a meal and it overflows from the upper gut to the hindgut, there is a risk of colic or possibly laminitis, but that usually is seen when you have a very, very high NSC feed, or for instance, the horse gets into the feed room, eats a whole bunch of grain, or a feed that is primarily a high NSC grain, such as corn, because corn is about 70% starch. Oats are kind of moderate for a grain. Oats are about 50% NSC. And then a lot of the ingredients you see these days in horse feeds are pretty low NSC. So I do want to caution people, when you look at a feed tag, for instance, and you see that there is some corn in the feed, don't get excited about that. Look at the total NSC of the feed, because it's the NSC provided by all the different ingredients that end up, being the total NSC in the feed. When the horse does eat sugar or starch, we primarily, you want the sugar and starch digested in the upper gut, in the small intestine, and then it's broken down. The starch is broken down into simple sugars, and then the simple sugars, primarily glucose, are absorbed from the small intestine into the bloodstream. And so you see an increase in blood glucose from a meal that is, moderate to high in NSC. That stimulates the pancreas to release the hormone insulin, and insulin's job is to help push the glucose in the blood into the tissues where it's going to be used or stored, and kind of then the blood level of glucose goes back down to its kind of normal steady state. This is a normal function in horses, and usually in a healthy horse it works just perfectly fine, and really nothing major to worry about. And the big risk with a healthy horse is just make sure that you don't overload the upper gut with too much sugar and starch for the digestive enzymes and absorption to work properly. There is also a thought that non-structural carbs can possibly, if you get a horse that's eating too much sugar, starch, does it make them high or hot? There's a thought out there. There's not a lot of good research indicating that that's, really the case. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence. Personally, in my life with lots of horses, I've been giving riding lessons and training horses for quite a few decades. I've not ever had a horse that gets hot on a higher NSC feed. It's not to say that it can't happen. I'm a big fan of plenty of turnout and work, and maybe that's why my horses, I don't see these issues. But if that's a situation that you do have, there's no problem with looking for a feed that's kind of low or moderate NSC. Again, I want to really I want to emphasize, though, that NSC is really important as a fuel, particularly during exercise. And the work duration and intensity dictate the type of fuel primarily used. Aerobic metabolism, which is basically long, slow distance work, that fuel is primarily fat, but it does use some glycogen and glucose. But anaerobic metabolism, which again is a very fast process, bursts of intense exercise. The only fuel for anaerobic metabolism would be glucose and glycogen, the storage form of glucose in the muscles. So again, really important that NSC is in the diet, because that glucose from the starch and sugars in the diet is the substrate for the glycogen. And horses can run out of glycogen. Don't know how many times I was a barrel racer growing up, and you hear people saying, man, I left my best run out in the warm-up pen. And that's really possible, because if the horse doesn't have adequate fat, for instance, to fuel aerobic activity, if you're warming up at an aerobic exercise, such as a walk, jog, trot, lope, or canter, you may be using up the horse's glycogen if there's not fuel. If you use up the glycogen with aerobic metabolism, you get into the pen for especially Western performance events or show jumping, and you've used up the glycogen, and the horse just doesn't have the energy to really perform its best. So again, it's really important to have the NSC in the diet.
Can I just I'm trying to think of what people might be thinking. So when you mention that they need glycogen, but is there sort of an average amount of NSC in a feed that you would consider high? You know, a lot of companies use high, medium, low.
That's a really good question, but there's not a specific answer because in that type of definition, we usually look at AFCO, which regulates labeling, at least in the US, and see how they define uh, the levels of a nutrient, and they don't. There's no specific definition. To me, as a horse person and a nutritionist, I basically consider very low NSC at probably 10 or 12% or less. And then low would be up to about 20%. And then 20 to low 30s would, in my opinion, would be moderate.
Mm-hmm.
And then above that would be high. But again, it depends on what the horse is doing for a living, because if the horse is a racehorse, those horses are fed feeds that usually have anywhere from 35 to 45%
Yeah.
NSC. But those are
And,
horses that do a lot of anaerobic exercise. Barrel racers usually are fed high grain sweet feeds. They do a lot of anaerobic exercise. And again, these are healthy horses, and I'll talk a little bit about there are some situations you need to be aware of the NSC. But if you've got an exercising, fit, healthy horse, NSC is just not something to be afraid of. And I wanted to clarify again what anaerobic exercise is: maximal intensity, short duration, and again, the fuel source is primarily glycogen. And that is a polysaccharide made up of glucose molecules. It's used as fuel, and once again, very importantly, dietary NSC provide the sugar molecules to build the glycogen. It's also important to realize, even though I've been talking about anaerobic exercise as using glycogen, in all types of exercise, it's never only one type of fuel used. Even aerobic activity is going to use some glycogen. So an endurance horse, which is definitely aerobic, primarily aerobic activity, the red here on the bar graph is glycogen and the yellow is fat, because fat is the primary fuel source for aerobic activity. So again, here in the endurance horse, primarily it's a very long distance endurance activity, so it's very aerobic, and you still see there's still a significant amount of glycogen used as a fuel. And a racehorse, this would be a thoroughbred racehorse, a lot of glycogen used. Still a little bit of fat, but a lot of glycogen. That is primarily anaerobic. And then a Western performance horse, which is almost completely anaerobic. You see how much glycogen that horse would be using during its activity, whether it's barrel racing or it could be roping, lots of different Western performance activities. But even those horses, there's still a little bit of fat used. So it's never one or the other. But just to make the point that all these horses do need glycogen. And when they're done with their exercise, if they've used up most of their glycogen, they've got to have the NSC in the diet to refill that glycogen storage. So how much NSC is too much? I think that's the big thing that horse owners want to know. And for a healthy horse, there's not a lot of research that indicates how much is too much. I do have a slide that I'll get to in just a moment that I can tell you pretty much how much is too much in a meal to make sure you don't overload the upper gut and get undigested NSC in the hindgut. hindgut, which can increase your risk of colic or possibly laminitis, but that's how much in a meal. That's not how much per day. And there are horses that do eat quite a bit of NSC in their total diet through the day. The other thing to remember about glucose, we've already talked about how important it is for glycogen, but it's also glucose, the sugar itself, is the only fuel used by the brain, and it's the primary fuel for, that's supposed to be feet. I have a typo, sorry. The primary fuel for the horse's feet. It's necessary for muscle function. It's a substrate for glycogen in muscles and liver. It's a fuel used for pretty much all body processes. And there is some research out there that shows that NSC restriction can reduce performance capability. A study at Texas A&M years ago actually, I believe it was Don Topleff, that worked on depleting glycogen in exercising horses, and that was right before I was at A&M for grad school. But I heard about that research, and boy, you didn't want to be messing with the horses when they were completely glycogen depleted, because they didn't have fuel for much of anything. So we do know this now. We also get questions about, well, that NSC is not natural for a horse. That's not a natural fuel. Well, yeah, it is. It's definitely a natural fuel. Grasses can be high NSC at certain times of the growth season, and some types of grasses can have as high as 40% NSC on a dry matter basis at certain times of the year. So yeah, there can be high NSC, and there are people I've heard that say, well, grain is not a natural feed for a horse. Well, yeah, grain's been fed to horses for years and years, and I have a friend who loves to dig back on the internet, and apparently there was a reference to the Hittites feeding grains to their horses, however many thousands of years ago the Hittites were around. But the other thing, even with wild horses, if you think about them out grazing on grass, the grasses go to seed. And those horses are not sifting out the seeds. They're eating the grass seeds, and they're going to be pretty high NSC. So it's not uncommon for horses naturally to eat pretty high NSC diets. But I did mention that you get too much NSC, overflow the upper gut, get excess NSC, and usually this is a situation, it's kind of a cold turkey change to the horse's hindgut, because the microbes in the hindgut are pretty good. If they have a chance to adjust to something new, they're pretty good at adjusting their populations and dealing with it. But if you get a sudden overflow of NSC into the hindgut, yes, you can get colic, you can get laminitis. And so it's important to realize the high NSC ingredients tend to be the cereal grains. Corn is, as I mentioned, about 70% starch. Oats are about 50%. Barley is kind of intermediate. So that's where a lot of the NSC in feeds come from. So it's good to be aware and know your own horse, know what kind of exercise you're trying to fuel, and be aware of the NSC of the feed that you're feeding. And so the maximum amount of starch to make sure that you do not overload the upper gut there have been a couple research studies. The most conservative estimate to not overload the upper gut is 2 grams per kilogram body weight per meal of NSC. So this chart is just to show how big of a meal you can feed an 1,100-pound horse without increasing the risk of undigested NSC overloading the upper gut and getting into the hindgut. So this column is for healthy horses, just to make sure you're not increasing the risk of colic or laminitis. And there's the idea out there that you shouldn't feed more than about 5 pounds of feed, whatever feed, in a meal. Well, that's based on this 2 grams per kilo body weight per meal, but it's based on grain. And so you've got to look at the total NSC in the feed. So for oats, about 50% NSC, that's, yes, about 5 pounds of oats in a meal is a pretty safe amount that's not going to overload the upper gut of an 1100 or 500 kilo horse. But if you have a little bit lower NSC feed, so this is going to be kind of a typical commercial sweet feed, corn, oats, barley, premixed pellets, some molasses, that's going to run about 35% NSC. And for that 1,100 pound, 500 kilo horse, you could feed about 7 pounds in a meal without overloading the upper gut. And if you take the NSC of the feed down a little bit more, so 27%, it's what I'd consider a pretty moderate NSC feed. And you could feed 9 pounds of that feed in a meal without overloading the upper gut. And you keep going down on NSC and you can feed more and more in a meal without being afraid that you're going to increase the risk of colic. So if you get down to one of those 10% NSC, very low NSC feeds, I would not say this is going to be a performance feed. This is a feed that would be suitable for a high risk, obese, sedentary, metabolic horse that's 10% NSC. And to not overload the upper gut with soluble carbs, you could feed 22 pounds in a meal. Now, nobody's going to do that. That's ridiculous, especially since those are horses. If they need that low NSC, they're probably obese. But that's just to illustrate that you've got to look at the NSC in the feed and what you're feeding for. So low NSC, you're not going to be running much risk at all of overloading the upper gut. You notice, though, there are 3 more columns there. Those are horses with different risk factors. So for horses that have risk factors that are sensitive to soluble carbs, you notice that 1 gram per kilo body weight per meal, that's for horses with gastric ulcers. For horses that are insulin dysregulated, then you may be down to 0.3 grams per kilo body weight per meal. And for a very, very high risk metabolic horse, this research was based on sedentary, obese, metabolic horses. The recommendation is all the way down to 0.1 gram per kilo body weight per meal. But that's a really small population of horses. And if you do have a horse that's that much at risk, yes, you got to be very careful with NSC, but you hopefully are doing other things to help that horse become less insulin resistant and get back healthier, because it's not a good way for a horse to live. Then we have the perception that possibly excess NSC can cause developmental orthopedic disorders in growing horses, things like osteochondrosis, contracted tendons, epiphysitis, all sorts of DODs that you can see in growing horses. And there is a perception out there that feeding too much soluble carb can increase the risk. But in reality, in research, the risk factors for DOD include, number 1, genetics. Some lines of horses, just the genetics are not necessarily established, but there is definitely evidence of heritability in the incidence of DODs. We also know from research that imbalances in diets can increase the risk of DODs. Sometimes deficiencies in minerals or imbalances in minerals, such as calcium phosphorus ratio being out of whack. Copper deficiencies can increase the risks of DODs. So a lot of the imbalances in diet can increase the risk. And then just excess calorie intake, which does not necessarily have anything to do with NSC, but we do know that if horses' growth rates can be influenced by the calorie intake. So if they have plenty of calories, they can grow faster. But if they grow too fast and they do not have the nutrients that they need to support that rapid growth, including protein and balanced minerals and vitamin intake, but they have lots of calories, that can increase the risk of DODs. Again, doesn't have anything to do with the NSC in the diet. It's just imbalances in the diet. Now, there are some theories that have been looked at uh, about hormonal factors that may be involved in the idiopathogenesis of DOD, which those hormones include insulin, which we talked about, the insulin and its role with glucose digestion, absorption, and metabolism, and also IGF-1 and IGF-2, which are also related to insulin, and then thyroid hormones. So there are thoughts that these hormonal factors can play a role in increasing the risk of DODs, but at this time the research is really inconclusive. So it is a thought, it's a theory, but we really don't know. We do know genetics, imbalances in diets, and excess calorie intake. And the other thing, so what is a normal NSC for young growing horses? What's a level that you can be pretty comfortable with? Well, let's look at mare's milk. I already talked about the amount of NSC you can see in green grass, and a lot of young growing horses are out grazing nice green pastures, but just mare's milk. Mare's milk is approximately 65% total sugar. That's a lot of sugar in mare's milk. It is the simple sugar lactose, which is just milk sugar. But mare's milk is about 10.5% dry matter. And of that dry matter, it's 1.29% fat, 1.93% protein, and 6.91% sugar. So mare's milk has a lot of sugar. And of course, again, it's got a lot more water than anything else, but 65% of the dry matter is sugar. So when people say, well, young horses, it's not normal for them to have higher NSC. Yeah, it is. So if you're feeding a growth feed that is, 25, 35% NSC, that's not an amount to really be concerned about. That's pretty normal for young growing horses. So the take home is, if you've got a healthy horse that's not sensitive to soluble carbs, you don't have to be terribly concerned about the NSC. There's no reason to completely ignore it. It's good to it's one of the nutritional aspects of your horse's diet to be aware of and to look at and make sure everything is balanced. But for a healthy horse, it's not something to really just go wild about. There are situations in which horses are more sensitive to soluble carbs, and it is important to be aware of that as well, though. Know your own horse to make sure that you have an appropriate diet. Some of the myopathies, PSSM1, PSSM2ER, RER, those are myopathies that can be managed by reducing the NSC in the horse's diet. Now, it doesn't mean we have to go down to trying to find a feed with almost no NSC. You just have to find a diet that is appropriate. For metabolic horses, insulin dysregulated horses, might want to go a little bit lower in NSC. However, important to keep in mind that not all obese horses are insulin dysregulated. They do tend to go together, but there are healthy horses that are just obese. And if that is the case, get the weight off. And sometimes obesity seems to be maybe there is a genetic predisposition for a metabolic horse to become insulin dysregulated, and obesity precipitates them over the edge. So obesity in horses is not a good deal. It is important, if you've got a horse that's gaining weight, work to get the weight back off, and taking weight off horses and exercising horses also helps make them more insulin sensitive, which is a good thing. Peripheral pars intermedia dysfunction, PPID, which was commonly known as Cushing's, but that's not an appropriate term for it anymore. Those horses sometimes suffer from insulin dysregulation, but not all of them. I heard several years ago about 30% of PPID horses are also insulin dysregulated. I don't know if that number is still correct, but still not all. I had one myself who was flaming PPID, and he was never ID, never had to deal with laminitis. He was on green grass, he was on a high NSC diet, was never an issue. Some laminitis horses you have to worry about NSC. Some laminitis is not caused by NSC in the diet. There are several different causes of laminitis, but if you do have a horse that's triggered by NSC, usually associated with insulin dysregulation, again, that is a time to really be concerned about the NSC in the diet. And then horses with gastric ulcers, particularly squamous ulcers. There is a thought that NSC can cause ulcers, but that's really not been proven. Higher NSC for horses with gastric ulcers, the NSC could possibly exacerbate the ulcers. But I was kind of involved in some research that we tried to cause ulcers in horses using a commercial sweet feed, and we're not able to do that. So it's hard to cause ulcers with NSC, but if you have a horse with squamous ulcers, it's good to be aware of the NSC in the feed. I do want to point out most horses do not need diets of a maximum 10% NSC, because that thought is out there. And if it's a healthy horse that is not sensitive to NSC, that is really restricting their diet, and especially if it's a performance horse and a growing horse. We want to make sure that they have everything that they need to fuel their exercise, fuel their performance, and fuel their growth.
And before we move on, just to let everybody know, the Q&A chat box or the Q&A box at the top, please, if you have any questions, put that in there. Maybe Catherine could address maybe a little bit of the different, the NSC between grassy hays and alfalfa hay. There's a belief out there, and I hear it a lot. I'm sure you guys hear it as well, that alfalfa hay is higher NSC than grass hays. You try and explain it, and people go, "Oh, really? No,
Yeah, I think sort of the alfalfa typically can be relatively low in NSC compared to some of the other grass, especially like the cool season grasses that can be high in NSC. But I think sometimes the issue with the alfalfa being considered a more calorie dense forage, so sometimes it wouldn't be the most appropriate for horses that maybe need that metabolic type horse that needs that lower NSC. So oftentimes it kind of gets NSC and calories sort of confused. So alfalfa can be lower in NSC than some of the other grasses. So it's not automatically not appropriate for all horses based on the NSC content. It's more, does that horse need a higher calorie, more digestible forage source? So thinking again about calorie needs plus sort of where the source of the energy or the calories are coming from, the digestible energy. So I think kind of going back to Katie's slide on with the table that kind of highlights some key, you've got to think about the horse's need, and then also what type of forage or even the feed you're feeding, how much NSC is in there, and then how much you're actually providing per meal or per day in the diet. So not just looking at the percentage in either the hay or the feed, thinking about how much you're actually going to be feeding as well. So
Great. And then while you were talking, a question came in. Can a horse gain weight from a higher NSC diet?
Well, it just depends on the calories.
Mhm.
You can have a high NSC diet that is moderate calories. You can have a very low NSC diet that's very high calorie.
Just the fat,
It's
fat and
fat.
fiber.
Fat is more than twice the calories per pound as carbs, either grains or hay. Let's see, the calories of a good quality alfalfa are actually getting to be kind of similar to the calories in oats. So, and the oats are about 50% NSC, and as Catherine said, the alfalfa tends to be very low NSC. So it's not the NSC itself is not a particular high calorie nutrient. Fat is the high calorie nutrient.
Yes. And looking at the overall diet.
And you got to look at the overall, whether it's a feed or whether it's the forage. Grass hays tend to be lower calorie than alfalfa, but you get a really good quality grass hay versus a really poor quality alfalfa, and the grass hay actually may be more calories. So again, you've got to look at the whole diet, and it's the balance, and again, the horse's needs.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, moving on to some facts and fallacies about protein. So first off, what is protein? Protein is a molecule that is made up of amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of protein. And there are different amino acids. There are about 20 to 22 amino acids. And each protein has its own array of amino acids. So all proteins are not alike. Proteins, or the amino acids, are necessary for muscle maintenance and repair. They replaces nitrogen lost in the sweat of exercising horses. I mean, protein's everywhere in the body. Protein is necessary for growth. It's necessary for performance. The enzymes in the body are protein. The organs in the body are made of protein. Protein is just everywhere. Now, dietary protein, and that's, so we've got protein in the body, and then we have dietary protein. When you feed the horse protein, when the protein passes through the small intestine, it's broken down into amino acids, and those amino acids are absorbed into the bloodstream and go off and build more proteins and do their jobs in the body. But if the protein is not digested and absorbed in the small intestine and passes undigested into the large intestine, then it's broken down not into amino acids, but into a carbon skeleton and nitrogen. And the carbon skeleton can be used as building blocks for various things, or it can be burned as fuel. And excess nitrogen is excreted as ammonia in the urine. So if you feed the horse more protein than is broken down and used in the upper gut, you're going to get ammonia in the urine, and you're going to get some carbon skeleton that can be used as a fuel source. But is that a problem? No, not really. It's for healthy horses, it's really no problem at all. One of the potential problems with excess protein would be if you're feeding a lot of protein, like high quality alfalfa hay that does have a lot of protein. And you might be feeding this in the winter because you're trying to put more calories into the horse, and you got the horse in the barn, and the barn is all closed up to try to keep it warm. And you walk in the morning and open the doors, and the ammonia almost knocks you over because of all the nitrogen that's flushed out in the urine as ammonia. So that could maybe be an issue if it gets out of hand for respiration. It's not great for a horse to be breathing in a lot of ammonia. But as far as causing problems for the horse in performance or growth, no, I would much rather see a little bit of excess protein, especially in a growing horse's diet, because we know that there are deficiency problems. If a young horse does not get adequate essential amino acids to support its growth, then you are going to be problems. You are going to see problems. So young horses do need high quality protein to provide essential amino acids for growth, because of the 20 to 22 amino acids, about 10 of them are essential, which means the body cannot synthesize those specific amino acids. They have to be provided in the diet. And they also have to be absorbed in the small intestine, where they're absorbed intact as amino acids. So you want to provide higher quality protein sources for the growing horses in particular, which would be milk proteins, soybean protein, usually soybean meal. Alfalfa is a pretty high quality protein. And there are lower quality proteins that are available, and you can find in usually less expensive feeds. Unfortunately, in horse feeds, you tend to get what you pay for. And the higher quality proteins are going to be more expensive than lower quality, which would include distillers grains, cottonseed meal, and the cereal grains. They may have enough protein, but it's not a good amino acid profile. And a deficiency of essential amino acids or a deficiency of dietary calories will result in reduced growth rate and potentially stunted growth. We do know that the first 3 limiting amino acids, we know lysine is number 1, and then threonine and methionine are pretty much assumed at this point to be 2 and 3, or 3 and 2. Those are the next 2 limiting amino acids. So even if a young growing horse is getting adequate crude protein, if there's not enough of the essential amino acids, they will not be able to grow to their genetic potential. And a good example of this is wild horses, or I guess actually feral horses. If you think about it, the feral horses tend to be smaller, but they're not getting any quality protein in their diets, and their growth is stunted. And you see this in horses. I see it pretty regularly. Somebody buys a horse and says, oh, this is going to be a nice 16-hand horse, and puts it on a good diet. And as long as it's not done growing, you can see a period of compensatory growth when this horse is finally getting the nutrients to grow, and it grows taller than you ever expected. Had that happen to me, I was very disappointed. I did not have my 16 to 16 2-hand horse. I had a 17-hand horse. But got him, and he got on a better diet, and lo and behold, he just had a couple more inches in him. Total calorie intake influences the growth rate. So when you get more calories, it can push them to grow faster, but you've got to have the right protein, vitamins, and minerals to help support that growth rate. And as I mentioned before, when they've got a lot of calories and they are growing fast, but they don't have adequate protein or vitamins, minerals, that's when you can have riskier growth and increased risk of DODs. The other thing you see with these young growing horses, if they're not on a good nutritional profile, you will see more growth spurts. So fast growth, slow down, fast growth, and you want a nice smooth growth curve. That's the best thing to support good healthy growth and reduce the risk of DODs. So the myth then is that excess protein can cause DODs. There are multiple studies that have disproved that. According to the NRC, National Research Council Nutrient Requirements of Horses in 2007, high protein diets do not appear to influence the occurrence of DOD. And then there are 1993 published research. Foals fed 126 of NRC recommendations of crude protein did not develop abnormal cartilage around the joints. And another study, 1994, the addition of essential amino acid lysine or a combination of lysine and threonine did not affect bone mineral content or skeletal growth rates. So feeding more protein or more amino acids than the published minimum requirements does not increase the risk of DODs. Take home, feed a total diet that does not oversupply calories. And it's kind of funny, I think on just about almost every one of these webinars at some point we've mentioned body condition scoring. Know how to body condition score your young horse. It's not that different from body condition scoring the adult horse, but you want to keep the young horse about a body condition score of 5. It's okay to see a little bit of ribs. If they're a little bit below a 5, that's okay, but we don't want to see a whole lot of fat, because what happens if you're starting to see a lot of fat on your young horse, that may be that you're getting an oversupply of calories and you're not getting enough protein, vitamins, and minerals to support growth. So if they don't have what they need to support growth and you keep feeding them more calories than they need, they're going to get fat. So a balance of calories with appropriate protein, vitamins, and minerals to support healthy growth will help produce a smooth growth curve, which again helps reduce your risk of DODs. Any questions on those? Got anything to add, Catherine?
No, no. I think on the protein.
That's a perfectly acceptable answer.
Yeah, you can write your questions in the chat, or you can write your questions in the Q&A. Just letting everybody know if they have any questions. All right, we'll carry on.
Then we will move on to concerns with feed ingredients, and we're going to start with the evil, evil soy. Oh. I'm a big fan of soy. Soy is the highest quality plant protein source. It's got a very nice array of essential amino acids, and soybean meal is the typical protein source for horses. But there are people who do have concerns about soy. And some of these concerns have spilled over from the human, human dietary concerns. And one of the first ones we hear about is that soy has phytoestrogens, which is true. Soy does have phytoestrogens. And soybean meal is going to be a little bit higher concentration of phytoestrogens than just the whole soybean. Phytoestrogens are plant-based compounds. They're chemically similar to estrogens. And there are some benefits of phytoestrogens. Phytoestrogens have been shown in humans to help prevent some types of cancer, but they have been seen in humans to cause some fertility problems. So the phytoestrogens are not all the same. Some of them are actually estrogen agonists that kind of work as estrogenic type compounds, but some are antagonists that function conversely to estrogen. So they're not all the same. And in the typical things that horses eat, soybeans, alfalfa, clovers, and flax all contain some phytoestrogens. But the thing is, in the horse's total diet, the phytoestrogen content is really pretty darn small. And typically, people get worried about the phytoestrogens in soy or soybean meal. And if you look at the amount of soybean meal to help meet a horse's protein requirement in the feed portion of their diet, it's a really small percentage of their total diet. And it's actually been shown that if you've got a horse that's on alfalfa and a feed that's got some soybean meal, they're getting considerably more phytoestrogens from the alfalfa than they are from the soybean meal. But quite honestly, there haven't been any research studies. There have been research studies in horses on phytoestrogens. There's been nothing that show any problems with phytoestrogens and like in brood mares. At this point, about the only thing they've shown that dietary phytoestrogens can show up in the horse's blood. So if they're eating phytoestrogens, they're getting some phytoestrogens into their body, but there haven't been any ill effects from phytoestrogens in horses. And the thing is, keep in mind that this is kind of blown over from people. And the issue in people, especially with people who are vegetarians and really depend on soy as their main protein source in their total diet, as well as it's a very big ingredient in a lot of vegetarians' diets. And that's where you can start seeing some problems versus horses that their diets are, forage based and maybe a little bit of soybean meal. And again, even the horses, the brood mares that are on a whole lot of alfalfa, they've just not seen any problems with phytoestrogens. So I would certainly not suggest to anybody that they try to avoid soy in their horses' diets because they're concerned with phytoestrogens, even with a brood mare. And I would be much more concerned that the horse is getting adequate essential amino acids than I would be worried about the potential phytoestrogens from that little bit of soybean meal. So that's one of the first concerns with soy. Another concern that I've been hearing more and more about is that soy is inflammatory. So that's based on the fatty acid composition of soy, and primarily in this case, this is soy oil. So phytoestrogens was more primarily soybean meal, and now inflammatory, although it's carried over to kind of everything soy is supposedly inflammatory. But the basis for that would be the fatty acid composition of the oil. Because there's a lot of attention been paid to omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids in the past several years, with the idea that omega-6 fatty acids are inflammatory and omega-3 fatty acids are anti-inflammatory. And so I don't know how the perception became that inflammation is just always bad, because it's not. Inflammation is a very important part of the immune response in animals. So inflammation absolutely has a role. And the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio in the diet, the balance of omega-3s and omega-6s, is an important thing. But the tricky part is we don't know in horses what that balance should be. There is, in the NRC, there is actually a published minimum requirement for omega-6 fatty acids, but in horses, we don't really have a published requirement for omega-3 fatty acids. We do know that green grass is a very rich source of omega-3 fatty acids, and in green grass, there are more omega-3s than there are omega-6s, but that doesn't mean that that ratio of the omega-3 to 6 fatty acids in the grass is what is needed in the horse's body. We just don't know that yet. We also, though, do know that if horses are fed, for instance, a diet that is very high in omega-6s, because some of the, like corn oil, has got a lot of omega-6 fatty acids and almost no omega-3 fatty acids. So you can get a diet fed to a horse that is quite obvious, even though we don't know what the balance should be. If we get way too much omega-6, we can say, yeah, that's probably out of whack. That's probably too much omega-6 compared to the omega-3s. And so there have been studies looking at inflammation in horses and looking at the omega-3 and omega-6 composition of like cell membranes and seen that we can affect that with diet. But again, we don't know exactly where the diet should be. So the reason that soy is considered kind of inflammatory, and I don't know if you can see I'm using air quotes, inflammatory, is because soy is about a 7-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. So is that bad? Well, don't really know. In humans, a ratio of 6s to 3s of about 10-to-1 is still considered acceptable. So that's why soy oil is considered inflammatory. But is it really inflammatory? At this point, we don't really know. What I will say is that if you have a horse that has a chronic inflammatory condition, and there are all sorts of things going on with horses that are chronic inflammation, and in that situation, feeding a supplement that is a very good source of bioavailable omega-3 fatty acids, such as fish oil or some of the algae supplements. KER has a very nice, quite palatable fish oil supplement that is high in the omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA, which are the bioavailable, highly bioavailable omega-3s. If you've got an issue of chronic inflammation, then and you're worried about it, give them a supplement with some good, high quality, bioavailable omega-3s. But worrying about soy as an inflammatory ingredient, there's just not research indicating that that is the case. So, and Catherine, you've kind of been more involved with the research on omega fatty acids. You want to add anything there?
I think you covered that really well. I think that again it goes over to how much you're feeding as well. So are you feeding a lot or a little? And if you're feeding a lot of something that has a lot of omega-6s and very little omega-3s, that could be an issue. But if it's just a little bit overall in a balanced diet, and considering overall the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is again a key point of not just focusing on one item in the diet.
And I think that's one of the biggest things that most people overlook. Everyone has this belief, this is bad or this is bad, but no one ever takes the time to really look at the amount that you're actually feeding, or the amount that might be consumed in the whole daily diet. It's just, focusing on one ingredient and saying you can't have it and not considering the amounts.
And I would say, looking at the pictures on my slides here, if you look at that bottom picture and that scoop of whole soybeans, if
That's a big scoop.
if that's your feed, that's probably not a good idea.
Yeah.
But that's not in any way a balanced feed for horses, and I would hope nobody's doing that kind of thing. So yeah, but okay. And the last thing I was going to talk about with soy is that there are a lot of people who are concerned with soy allergies, and I'm going to talk about serum allergy testing, because usually we find out when people feel that their horses are allergic to soy, they've had a serum allergy test. They've had perhaps some allergy symptoms, and so they have a serum allergy test, and soy shows up positive. And soy shows up positive on a whole lot of serum allergy tests. So before I get into that, is there anything else on soy we should talk about?
No, I think those are the inflammatory and the phytoestrogens is the main.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I think in the notes or something, we've got a paper on, what's the title of it? Soy for Horses, Facts and Fallacies. That is on the KER website. So maybe in the notes we can have the link to that. Anybody has more questions about soys? So the last ingredient I want to talk about this evening is molasses. The evil, evil molasses, which is the liquid residue left after condensing the sap of sugarcane or sugar beets until sugar crystals precipitate. And horses love molasses. And my previous job, we were tasked to try to find something, some ingredient that we could replace, preferably a liquid ingredient that we could replace molasses with, something that horses would love as much and would have the same advantages as molasses, and we just couldn't. But quite honestly, I mean, molasses as an ingredient is not evil at all. It's a great ingredient. The advantages, of course, it improves palatability, it reduces dust, it reduces sorting, it's a pelleting aid. It helps make a better quality pellet, so when you pour out your pelleted feed, it all doesn't just fall apart and become a mush. It helps maintain moistness, it helps extend shelf life, and it improves mixing integrity. So there are a lot of benefits to molasses. But horse owners, and we're kind of back to the NSC thing, look at it and say, but it has so much sugar in it. And we're already afraid of NSC, so maybe we need to be afraid of molasses as well. And first off, again, healthy horses, really just not an issue. And secondly, even though molasses has a pretty high sugar content, the total amount contributed in the formula in the feed is usually pretty darn minor. So the perception is most likely quite a bit higher than reality. Now I will admit, I formulated some of the racehorse feeds in the South, particularly Florida, and those racehorses like their feed wet. So you could get pretty high molasses content, but thoroughbred racehorses, the amount of sugar and starch in their diets is really not a problem. However, in typical horse feeds, you're going to see 5 to 12% molasses in the feed. So it's not, you get 5% molasses, that is really not a lot of molasses. And it can, again, it can be really helpful in keeping a pellet together, and it can be really helpful in palatability because you can put together the best, most nutritious, perfect formula for a feed for horses, but if the horse doesn't eat it, it does nobody any good at all. So molasses as a palatant is an amazing thing. But then when you look at actually start doing the math, which I actually had to have Catherine help me do the math. So they're going, I know I'm messing up decimal places. It's been a long time since I had to do math, but I think I got the math right. Molasses is really tricky too because it's not consistent at all. The amount of water in molasses can vary. The amount of sugar in molasses can vary. But molasses is about 18 to 30% water, and it contains approximately 37% sugar, but you can look and you can find other numbers for it. You can find a little bit less than 30%, 37%. You can find a little bit more than 37%, but I picked 37. So then I did the calculations. If you've got 5 pounds or 2.27 kilos in a meal, one meal of feed, and let's say it's a pelleted feed with 5% molasses for palatability and to help keep the pellet nice durability for horses, that actually calculates out to less than 45 grams of sugar from the molasses. So if you think about your 500 kilogram horse, less than 45 grams of sugar is not a lot in the meal. So there are a lot of benefits to molasses. I think it's been maligned unfairly. So again, it's not an ingredient. It's a good ingredient, and it's not evil. And again, when you look at your total feed, you can have a feed that is 5% molasses, and actually the total NSC is like 12%. So it's an ingredient. It's not a magical ingredient. It's not an evil ingredient. It's got a lot of advantages, and when used in an appropriate amount in a feed, it's a great ingredient.
Over the years, many times, if I've had a horse that's not doing well or not wanting to eat, a little bit of warm molasses water on some feed, put it in the water. If you have a horse that doesn't like to drink, put a little
Yep.
bit of molasses in the water, especially if you're traveling. Oh, I love molasses. I like it too.
If you've got a horse that you're trying to deworm it with a paste dewormer, or maybe you're trying to give it paste bute or something, and it's a tall horse, and its head is like way up here, and you're trying to get the syringe in its mouth. I have found if you dip the syringe in some molasses, they get much better about letting you put a syringe in their mouth.
That's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it has its place.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So the next topic is allergies in horses. Allergies are common in horses. You can see this picture of a horse with hives. Management and environment are typically what produce allergies, and that's how you can manage allergies. You got to differentiate, though, signs of allergies from other causes of skin lesions. Pruritus, which is itchy skin with raised lesions, generally indicate an allergy, but also may be due to parasites or bacteria or fungal infections. So just because your horse has itchy hives, that doesn't always mean it has an allergy, but that is the typical symptom for allergies. Types of allergies would be insect hypersensitivity, contact allergies, can be inherited, dermatological, respiratory, food allergies, and that's what I'm going to really be talking about. And that kind of comes, when we talk about soy, and people are worried about soy because they feel their horses are allergic to it. Food allergies in horses are rarely documented. They're largely anecdotal, poorly understood pathogenesis, and quite honestly, food allergies in horses are uncommon. It's not impossible, but usually the allergies that are attributed to food or feed ingredients, there's something else going on, because it's usually not actually in the feed. It's difficult to identify specific allergens, and the primary treatment when allergies are detected is try to avoid the allergens. So the veterinarian, and this, when your horse has a bad case of hives, you want to get your veterinarian in. They need to go through the history and be thorough and methodical. Look for patterns, look for changes. Then they want to look at the clinical signs, the pattern, shape, size, and distribution of lesions, because that can indicate what type of allergy it is, and go through the process of elimination on what may be causing these allergies. And then just treating the clinical signs, corticosteroids, antihistamines. Recurrence and recrudescence are common. There's a risk of adverse effects. It would really help to have good tools to help identify specific allergens. And this is where serum allergy testing comes in. And I've got a little more to talk about. IgE is identified as the antibody associated with allergies, and that happened in 1966, so that's been around for a long time. And then there are antigen-specific IgE antibodies. So you can look for the antibodies to the antigens of the allergen. The allergen is the specific compound that is causing the allergic reaction, whether that be, so it's usually a protein. It could be a protein from an insect bite or sting. It could be a protein that the horse comes in contact with. There are horses that are allergic. They break out in hives and they figure out somebody used a new fly spray. Somebody used a different shampoo. All these that maybe use different shavings. And there is something that the horse comes in contact with that elicits this allergic response. So intradermal skin test, and those of you who have had your own allergy testing, it's a skin prick test. And it's just, I had that when I was a kid. It's just so fun. And they inject all these little different allergens, purified allergens, or just basically purified little proteins from all these different things that you might be allergic to, and they poke them into your body in a little grid. And a positive is you get this wheel formation, or, on my skin prick, it was like a little mosquito bite. And I was allergic to English plantain, which is some sort of plant, which was really bizarre. I don't know. But anyhow, that's kind of the gold standard for allergy testing. It's not very typically done on a horse because you got to shave them, and then if you got to prick them off with all these needles, and it's certainly not something that you're going to have a vet come out and do on a farm. It's pretty specialized. And there are more limitations. Okay, not good in the field, multiple needle sticks. It's hard to interpret due to variability, so you really have to have a veterinarian who's kind of specializing in dermatology. The pure, especially for horses, the purity of commercially available allergen extract is questionable. Think about if your horse is allergic to some sort of specific gnat, and you're looking for commercially available pure gnat protein, yeah, that's going to be hard to find. Medication withdrawal is required, and the horse should be clinically normal at the time of testing. And so that's, if your horse is having hives, then you trying to get rid of everything before you do the test to find out what was causing it. That's kind of hard. Got to take off all the hair, and it's not diagnostic for all forms of allergic disease. And I want to point out, for example, respiratory and food allergies. Even skin prick tests are not diagnostic for food allergies. So the next type is serum allergy testing. And serum allergy testing has some really nice positive benefits in that it's easy. You can do it in the field. You just take some blood. The theory behind serum allergy testing is that allergic patients have this higher circulating IgE. And there are two types of tests that can be done with serum allergy testing: the radio allergosorbent test, or RAST. That was developed in 1967, and then ELISA methods were developed in the 70s. And it's a much easier test to run. They're looking for specific allergen and antibody reactions in the blood. So you can just plate the blood and put in the purified allergens and look for this interaction. And it was developed in humans to start with, and then started being used for veterinary applications in the 80s. It is still being used today. There's several commercial labs that offer serum allergy testing. It's convenient, it's easy, it's fast, and it's moderately priced. So a lot of people are doing this, but there are some big limitations. Number one, the purity of allergen extracts. And same thing as I just mentioned, trying to get purified protein from specific gnat or bedding or whatever might be used in fly spray. So what you get is crude extracts that contain non-target proteins, which still are bound to the solid phase and interfere with the target antibody. So you get false positives from that. And then also competing antibodies, because normally horses have very high circulating levels of IgG and IgE, so you can get cross-reactivity and interference. There's a possible role of IgG in allergic disease, and pre-assay removal of IgG is ineffective and inadequate, so you can have positive reactions just from these other antibodies in the blood. So again, you can get, false positives. And also the reagents that are used, the reagent specificity and sensitivity is critical to avoid false results. The reagents also often are developed with non-target species, so you can get with mouse, dog, rabbit, and human, so you can get false results. There's research on polyclonal versus monoclonal, which I must admit, I haven't read it. I'm not even quite sure what that's about. Don't really know much about the FC receptor with the conserved high affinity binding site, and then purified monoclonal equine anti-IgE, IgGB, IgGT. There's all sorts of problems here. Getting into the research, which I will admit, I was not the one who did this. A good friend of mine who's a veterinarian, Dr. Kathy Williamson, is the specialist in this, and she put these slides together for me. But all of these things go together to say serum allergy testing gives you a lot of false positives. And when you start reading the literature, you can find that there's a lot of questions about serum allergy testing. And so this was back in my previous career, working with Dr. Williamson, and looking at these serum allergy tests led to a quick and dirty experiment. So Dr. Williamson actually took 2 serum samples. She submitted the samples to 2 different serum allergy testing labs. And so she used Company A, which used a polyclonal ELISA test, and Company B used a RAS test. And looking at the information provided by those companies, there was no further information available on validation or quality control. So there were no validation studies to show that the results from the testing actually were real, were appropriate. She then assessed agreement between the companies, looking at results from trees, grasses, weeds, and food panels. And when she compared the 4 tests, she looked at only allergens tested by both companies, because their companies use different allergens, so they may have results that say that the horses are allergic to completely different things depending on what allergens are included in their tests. So when she compared, agreement equals both companies deliver the same result, either positive or negative, for the same allergen. So she looked at Company A, positive were HPP and BLP, and negative, this is vet stuff, so I'm going to jump over it. Sorry. But let's get to the patients. So these were the horses that she sent in the serum samples. Remember, she used the 2 horses, Bay Cruiser and Trixie, and she sent a serum sample from each horse to 2 different labs. And these are the histories on Bay Cruiser and Trixie. Bay Cruiser was a 15-year-old thoroughbred gelding. History of pruritic urticaria on barrel and neck, so itchy hives, nasal discharge with occasional cough. It was seasonal, and Bay Cruiser was in the stall 50% of the time and a dry lot paddock 50% of the time. His diet was Bermuda grass hay, and then a 14 protein, 6% fat pelleted feed. Trixie 8-year-old quarter horse mare, history of pruritus, hives, and hair loss on face and neck, mild chronic colic and diarrhea, not seasonal. Trixie was mostly mostly pastured, but stalled twice daily for grain meals and for grooming. And her diet was fescue pasture, mixed grass hay, and 12% protein, 8% fat, textured feed. It was actually a pelleted feed with a fat nugget in it. So here are the test results for Bay Cruiser from Company A and Company B. And you can see it's easier to tell. Yeah, nobody's going to look at all the numbers from Company A, but we've got the agreement results. But Company B, it's a lot easier to tell all the little red boxes, all the things that Bay Cruiser was allergic to. So yeah, Bay Cruiser's got some issues going on. You're going to have to worry about him. Trixie, but looking at Trixie, I mean, even more red boxes. So man, we're gonna have to start looking out and figuring out what we can possibly. There are environmental allergens. There's grasses. There's trees. All sorts of things. There's some food and feed ingredients in there. But yeah, we got a lot of allergies going on with both Trixie and Bay Cruiser. And then just the raw results for Bay Cruiser Company A had 24 positive out of 89 allergens. And remember, we're just looking at the allergens that the two companies tested the same ones. So Company A, 24 positive out of 89, 0 foods. Company B for Bay Cruiser, 18 positive out of 56, 3 foods, molasses, oats, and wheat. And the agreement between Company A and Company B, 22 results out of 36 agreed, or 61%. For Trixie, Company A, 27 positive out of 89 allergens, and 2 foods, beets and corn. And Company B, 21 positive out of 56, and 5 foods, barley, corn, Milo, oats, and I have to look at my slide here. I have to move rice bran. So, okay, we're gonna have to feed Trixie something with no barley, corn, Milo, oats, or rice bran. We're gonna feed Bay Cruiser no molasses, oats, or wheat. But agreement between companies for Trixie, 22 results out of 36, or actually 61% agreement. So Bay Cruiser and Trixie were at least the same there. And it's gotten stuck. I may have to quit sharing and yep, I'm gonna have to stop sharing and go back in. Okay, and then let's share it again. Won't move now? Nope, I'm gonna have to get out of. Sorry, my computer has gotten tired and decided to get stuck, and so I'm gonna share it, and I think this will work this time.
Hey,
Can't be, it can never go perfectly. Okay, yay! Now the thing with these serum allergy testing, the companies do offer you help. They offer immunotherapy recommendations. So for Bay Cruiser, Company A offered a 2-vial set of injections for $167 that you'd be giving them injections for 5 to 7 months. And Company B offered a 1-vial set, $69.50 for 9 months. Now for Trixie, Company A offered still a 2-vial set for the same price, but it also had specialized individual injections for venomous insects, and they suggested an elimination diet for the food allergies. And Company B still had a different 1-vial set for, again, $69.50 for 9 months. So yay, we've got something now we can help our horse with allergies, right? Here's the tricky thing. This is Dottie. Dottie was an 8-year-old quarter horse mare. Dottie is Bay Cruiser and Trixie. The blood all came from Dottie, and it was split, and it was sent with the histories for Bay Cruiser and Trixie to the two different labs. Dottie had no history of allergic disease whatsoever. She was perfectly healthy. This was a photo taken the day of the sample collection. You can see there are no hives. She's just perfectly fine. Side-by-side comparison of Dottie, or Bay Cruiser / Trixie, between Company A and Company B. Company A had 12 discrepancies between Bay Cruiser and Trixie. 5 allergens positive for Bay Cruiser, not found in Trixie. 7 positive for Trixie, not found in Bay Cruiser. Agreement was 58 of 89, or 65%. Similar thing with Company B, 17 discrepancies, 7 positive on Bay Cruiser, not found on Trixie, 10 positive on Trixie, not found on Bay Cruiser. Agreement, 35 of 56, or 63%. It was all the same horse. It was all the same blood. Now, Dr. Williamson purposefully skewed Trixie's history to suggest food allergies, and she was reported to be allergic to 6 food items versus 3 for Bay Cruiser, but in reality, Dottie didn't have any food allergies. Dottie didn't have any allergies. So what does this tell you about the validity of serum allergy testing? And my computer decided to stop again. I got it going. Serum allergy testing cannot accurately diagnose food allergies. This is a statement by the American College of Veterinary Dermatology. And actually, in New York, it is illegal to use serum allergy testing for food allergies in humans. So it's actually, they made a law because it's not valid. The thing to use to determine if the horse has any food allergies, again, it's uncommon. It's not out of the question. There are horses that are either allergic or sometimes just sensitive, which is kind of a different deal. Sensitivities result in digestive issues. Allergies result in things like hives and itchiness, and sometimes snotty nose and runny eyes. It's kind of similar to humans. But the only thing to diagnose a food allergy or sensitivity is an elimination diet. So, only reliable method, horse needs to be symptomatic at the time the trial begins. They got to be off all the medications that would affect their reactions. And you got to take out everything. You remove all concentrates, all supplements, all treats, and you maintain the horse on a grass hay only diet for 4 to 8 weeks. As a nutritionist, yes, it's not nutritionally perfect, but any horse is going to be okay for 4 to 8 weeks on a grass hay diet. And if the clinical signs persist, it's most likely not a food allergy. If you suspect that the horse is allergic to the specific hay type, then change the hay. And again, if clinical signs persist, it's not a food allergy. If the clinical signs resolve on the elimination diet, possibly it's a food allergy. Then you start adding back the components one at a time. And if the signs come back when you add a component, you can say, maybe they are allergic to that thing. And then you might want to take it away and see if the signs go away again. And if they do, then you don't add it back in. But if the signs don't reoccur, well, see if the signs recur. If they don't, it's probably not a food allergy. As you add everything back in and you don't get the signs, it's probably not a food allergy. And a lot of times you start talking to a horse owner and they have these allergic symptoms, and it's like in the spring or the fall, it's kind of seasonal, and you're going, it could be a pollen, it could be an insect, it's probably not a food. Or the horse has been on the same diet for 5 years and suddenly gets hives, probably not a food allergy, probably something in the environment changed. And I do want to mention on these serum allergy tests, some of the ingredients are positive on almost every test, and one of them that does come back positive on pretty much every test is flax. And when Dr. Williamson did this little quick and dirty test, at that point, flax had not been added to serum allergy testing. It has now, and it is almost everyone I've seen is positive for flax. And I personally have never seen a horse that's actually allergic to flax. And there's most likely an issue with the antigen that's being used in the serum allergy testing for flax. And it's a known thing that they're going to be positive. And the companies just don't really seem to be worried about that. So the conclusions, virtually no information is available on commercial testing procedures and validation. There's poor agreement between tests and testing companies. High rate of false or clinically irrelevant positives. Results are not reliable or reproducible. Companies have a vested interest in positive results because they can sell you the cures. IST is still considered the gold standard for allergies other than food, but an elimination dietary trial is the only valid method of diagnosing food allergies in horses. Any questions on, you can tell I'm a big fan of serum allergy testing.
Yes. Well, we've had this discussion, and it's hard for customers or people who get the horses tested, and the vet has done that, and so they believe what they're reading and not knowing that there's so many false positives.
Well, and of course, and there are times that you've got these horses with these symptoms, and you're trying to figure out what's going on, and this is it's an easy test to run, and it's not a terribly expensive test, and it's just it's really frustrating. And yes, and we get horse owners that call and say, what feed do you have that basically has nothing in it?
Yeah.
Going, here is a bag of air.
So somebody is, because we've had this discussion, but it's being brought to attention here that there is a brand of feed that is sort of using the fear of flax, and taking flax out of their feeds based on it being a high allergen. And
Yeah.
I don't know how you go against that, because and we know that it's rare, it's rare, almost non-existent.
We just try to educate, one person at a time. And obviously this is something that veterinarians are, and we're fighting the companies that offer these serum allergy testing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and again, veterinarians are looking to help their clients deal with the horses with issues. So
yeah,
we'll just keep plugging along one at a time. And
yeah, exactly. Okay, we better move along here.
okay, last one, manufacturing processes. And this just came about. There's been quite a bit of marketing on different manufacturing processes, and is one better than the other? And so I've just the main question was pelleting versus extrusion. I've seen quite a bit of marketing on how much more beneficial extrusion is than pelleting. And I threw micronization in there just because there was a little bit of marketing there too. But first off, what are these? What are these manufacturing processes? Okay, in pelleting, the ingredients of the final feed are ground and they're mixed, and then steamed and conditioned to increase the moisture content and the heat. And then the mix is pushed through a die with pressure to form pellets. So you just have grinding, you have heat and steam, and then you have pressure. And that's the processing. And it kind of, I don't know, there's a lot of chatter out there about the evil of processed feeds. And I'm not really sure what evil we're adding in when we grind and mix and steam and squish. Doesn't seem too bad to me. So, but that's what pelleting is. And in extrusion, the ingredients are ground and mixed, and then they're cooked with moist heat. So there's more heat than in pelleting, and it's wetter, and it's cooked to a really high temperature. And then the mash is pushed through the die for the shape. And these die for pellets and for extrusion, they can be different sizes, and in extrusion they can be all sorts of different shapes too. But then, so the mash is pushed through the die for whatever shape the die results in, and then it comes through, and then when it comes out, there's a sudden drop in the pressure, and the cooler air, that sudden change to cooler air and the reduction of pressure causes the starch molecules to explode into the nugget shape. So that's what extrusion is, and I've got the pictures there, but basically, dog and cat food is what you typically see extruded. Micronization, as I said, that's been marketed a bit in the past few years. And in micronization, this is just with cereal grains, and the grain is heated, it causes the moisture to evaporate and create pressure. And with the heat, the endosperm ruptures and it makes the starch more accessible. So you can get micronized barley, micronized corn, oats. We don't see it as much in the US, but like in Australia, we tend to have rolled or steam flaked, and steam flaking is similar to micronization, but especially in Australia, you get a lot more micronized grains. But so that's what pelleting and extrusion and micronization actually is. So, extruded or pelleted, which is better? The claim now is that extrusion increases digestibility of nutrients. And I got to say, when I was in grad school, that was the assumption. We all kind of believed that going through the cooking process, the nutrients are more available in the feed. So when you feed an extruded feed, you're going to get more digestion and absorption of nutrients. But the research actually in horses doesn't really show that. Extrusion, does it increase upper gut digestibility of starch when you kind of cook the starch first and gelatinize that starch? The thought was, yeah, that you should have more upper gut digestion of starch, which also, though, if that's true, you're going to have more of a glucose and insulin response from the starch in the diet. And for some horses, is that a good thing? Might not be. But in reality, from the 2007 NRC, they quoted research that starch gelatinization in processed barley and corn in horses, either micronized or extruded, the starch gelatinization was greater than what you would see in the rolled grains. So there was that. And then in 2008, there is a journal article in JEVS with Gordon et al. And actually, I was desperately looking for this paper because I remembered the results and found the paper and said, oh, I was one of the authors on that. Okay, that's funny. But in that, we were looking at extrusion versus pelleting versus actually ovals, which are kind of big pellets, and found no benefits of extrusion. And extrusion did not slow the ingestion, which the horses didn't eat any slower on the extrusion versus the pellets. The extrusion did not enhance nutrient uptake, and the extrusion did not produce different glycemic responses compared to the pellets or ovals. So I said, okay, well, extrusion is not all that great as we previously thought. Then some unpublished data from 2014 that was done by Purine Animal Nutrition, and the director of research at the time sent me this information looking at pelleted versus extruded complete feed, because they were looking at did the senior feed, would it be better if it was extruded? Would it be better for the horses? And in that research, starch, dry matter, and neutral detergent fiber intake and digestibility of the pellets were actually greater than the extruded nuggets. And then in a Texas A&M thesis that I found on Google Scholar, written by Mallory Gehring in 2007, found that dry matter digestion was greater in pellet versus extruded. Starch digestion was greater in pelleted versus extruded, and digestion and rate of intake decreased by extrusion process. So is extrusion better than pelleting? I would say at this point from the research, no. But I will tell you, extrusion is more expensive than pelleting. So you're paying more for the processing when you get an extruded feed. And the one time I will say absolutely extrusion can improve over pelleting is when you want something to have a higher fat content, because you can make an extruded nugget with much more fat in it than you can make a pellet. A pellet, you can get a pellet to stick together with about 6% internal fat, 8%, some of the fat's got to be external, 10%, a lot of the fat's got to be external. But an extruded nugget, you can get like 30% fat in an extruded nugget and still have it hold together and not fall apart to mash. So in that situation, if you want a good way to add some fat to a feed, if that's the goal, then doing it with an extruded nugget may be a good way to go. So that's what I've got for extrusion versus
Yep.
pelleting.
I think it's pretty simple. But again, marketing.
Yep.
Certain companies are making extruded feeds and they market that it's better when it's really not.
And like I said, I was involved in that research in 2008, and we were flabbergasted that just we expected to find benefits of extrusion and we did not.
All right.
So there you go.
Anything to add, Catherine? No. Well, I don't see any questions, so I thought we would have questions, but we don't. So it's been very nice having you to do this series, and hopefully someone said thank you again for a great session. Another one, thank you so much. So I think we've covered some good topics, and hopefully we'll come back in the fall with some new topics. Maybe we'll make them a little shorter, so they're not so. But just so everybody knows, our YouTube channel has all these recorded, so you can go and watch these. And thank you very much, everyone, and have a great evening.